So Jason runs Outpost, which is a company looking to bring things back from space. We've been talking about launch for this whole conference, and Jason's all about bringing things back. So Jason, why don't we start with a very brief outline. So give me the elevator pitch for a company. What is it that you're trying to do that people in this room perhaps aren't thinking so much about?
Sure. Yeah, so for anybody who hasn't heard of Outpost before, we're the company that's making satellites that return. What's remarkable about this technology that we can talk about is we're hitting 5-meter targets on the ground. So not only return from orbit, but achieving a 5-meter accuracy anywhere on the planet. If I could, I'll just explain maybe the backstory of how we got there. So a little bit about me first. Before this, I built a company called Made in Space, where we brought 3D printing to space and really the first manufacturing done off Earth. And it was, it was a really difficult problem to build 3D printers that would work on the space station in zero gravity, and difficult to convince NASA to put it there. It turned out the hardest thing that we were trying to solve was getting anything back. We were building the first things ever manufactured off Earth, and we needed to get them home to test them. And it was really problematic. It took a long time. And then really like the nail in the coffin was one day the Smithsonian called, and they wanted to put the 3D printer in the Air and Space Museum. It took 6 years to get that home. And that was like with NASA working their hardest, it took 6 years. So I was, for the last decade, banging my head against the wall on Earth return. And it's how I figured out that we've sent 15,000 tons to orbit and only 200 tons have ever come back. So the way we see it is space is really today a one-way street. And if you look forward at least a couple decades into the future of space, it's clear that space can't always be a one-way street. There has to be a return lane. And that's what Outpost is here to do.
So that's an amazing stat that there's been 15,000 tons, you say, that's gone into space and only 200 that's come back. I mean, I'm assuming some more has come back but just burned up in the atmosphere and is distributed around, but you're talking about 200 tons have come back to the surface.
Safely returned.
And safely returned, exactly. So just give me a sense of the kinds of things that you hear about in terms of what might want to come back. So many satellites, people might not want them to be back or might not need them back safely. So what kinds of objects are we talking about?
Sure. So I think it's probably important to understand that return in general, like in any industry, is a market multiplier. It's you can go to like the early days of shipping exploration. It was all about going to some new world and bringing the riches back home. Amazon has completely dominated e-commerce by making returns as easy as purchases. SpaceX, of course, has dominated launch by making a returnable booster. So return in general is a market multiplier. And that's true across all of what we're doing in space. So if you go, for everybody here as a satellite manufacturer, you would know this well. Today's satellites are flying for 3 to 5 year missions. It turns out that a large percentage of the cost of these satellites have well into the 15 or 20 years of capable mission life. So that's a lot of money left on the table at the end of these short missions. And if you can recover the satellite, you can actually just refurbish it and fly it again.
When you say it's a market multiplier, is it just purely because of the economic reasons? As you say, if you can bring it back, sure, it's cheaper than to send it back again or use the components in some other way? Is that the argument?
So if you can bring the satellite back, and put new batteries in, top off the fuel tank, replace something that Moore's Law innovated on, that will be cheaper than building a new satellite. So that's one. There's entirely new missions that are possible now with return that you could have never done before. So that multiplies on the market.
Such as?
Well, we can do point-to-point delivery. So the shortest missions we'll do at Outpost are around the globe. And that we can go from launch to landing in as quick as 90 minutes. So that's not even a possible mission scenario today, but as soon as you have satellites that are capable of getting into orbit and returning, you can do that.
Okay, so that's kind of like it's a continuum between the point-to-point transport that we heard about earlier in some way, right? So it's not the kind of thing that perhaps people are thinking about when they're thinking about satellite return. It's more of a transport in that case. I guess you talked about the size of the problem and the fact that it's a multiplier for the market. Just talk to me right now about, before getting onto your technology, how do satellites get returned today and what's the complexity involved?
Oh. Well, I mean, not many satellites get returned today.
Or whatever else gets returned in that case,
I mean,
if anything.
Today, if you want to go to space and come back, you basically are flying on a Dragon to the space station. So it's $120,000 per kilogram. You're one of 100 payloads, so you're probably very low on the priority list. Like I said, it can take months or years even to come back. Or you build a capsule. That's what we see like traditionally being done, is build a small capsule. The issue though is that a small capsule has a very small amount of payload mass fraction, meaning the total mass of the vehicle, 5, maybe 10% of it is the thing they're trying to get back. And that makes it really hard to close any business case. So, and the reason that's the case is that the typical, like traditional reentry technologies, ablative heat shields, parachute systems, all those things are pretty massive. And when you scale down, you lose that mass capability for your payload. And the root problem there is that anything reentering the atmosphere and coming to land has to deal with landing dispersion. And this can be 1,000 kilometers across of literally uncertainty of where you'll land.
So you have no idea where it's going to go.
That's like trying to land here at this hotel and accidentally ending up in Silicon Valley. So that's a big amount of uncertainty. The way that's always been solved with like a space shuttle or Dragon is they carry extra propellant. And on the way in can do course corrections and find a nominal trajectory. And that's how SpaceX can hit a 5-kilometer radius in the ocean. So when you scale down, though, into the size of a satellite, you don't have room for extra propellant. If you do, you're sacrificing payload margin. So that's how it's always been done, and what we focused on was a completely different reentry solution that doesn't require extra propellant or heavy systems for reentry.
Okay, so describe your system then for us.
Yeah, sure. So what we wanted to do was solve the landing dispersion issue. So we have a 2-part reentry system. The first is a heat shield that deploys. So unlike a traditional heat shield that is essentially a rigid capsule, we have a deployable heat shield. And what's unique about it is it creates a very large surface area. So the satellite sits behind that big heat shield surface, and the larger that surface area is on a reentry, the lower the ballistic coefficient is, which means we come in really slow. So a typical system, like a capsule, is hypersonic into the lower atmosphere. It's coming in really fast. We are subsonic by 30 kilometers. At very high altitude, we've transitioned into a subsonic regime.
And that's because of these ablative shields you're talking about?
For us, it's because we have a large surface area heat shield. It's like imagine like a cup on a dinner plate. Like we're coming in real slow. We transition to subsonic higher up. At that point, we open a robotic paraglider that we've developed. It's a single surface fabric that, unlike a parachute that has a pretty low glide ratio and can't be opened maybe above 7 kilometers, we're opening at 20 kilometers. So we've been doing a lot of high altitude weather balloon drop tests to prove that out. And what that system allows us to do is the landing dispersions have not grown that much at 20 kilometers. So we still have a small amount of dispersion, and then we can navigate our way autonomously to the landing site. And that's over 50 flight tests now, and so today we're hitting 5-meter targets with that system.
Okay, and the system you're talking about, does it require whatever's launched to have in mind that you're going to return in the same way that you talked about? Or can your system be retrofitted to things that are up there right now?
We thought about building this as like a subsystem to make it so anybody building a satellite could just somehow hook this on and make a returnable version. And it doesn't really work that well as a business, because what that requires us to do is go convince every satellite manufacturer that they should all of a sudden redesign their system to accommodate this kind of returnable thing. So we're going after markets that are completely separate from that. Point-to-point logistics, getting things onto orbit and off of orbit. But in the long run, what this allows us to do is to deploy satellites. So if you're a manufacturer, you can put your vehicle on ours, and we can deploy you into orbit. And eventually, I mean, it's a hard problem of RPO and proxops and everything, but eventually we could actually recover satellites and bring them back. And when we get there, I think that what we can actually do is give all satellite manufacturers an ability to have a reusable satellite without them having to design reusability.
How big can you go with the technology you've got at the moment? And then I guess if it's successful, you might build other versions. But right now, how big can you come back? What's the payload that can come back?
So the technology we have scales really well. But today, what we're building is a 200 kilogram vehicle, and we'll start at close to like a 25% payload margin, and we can move towards 50%. So you can think like 50 to 100 kilograms of payload to orbit and back.
100 kilograms.
That's kind of like the goal that we're shooting towards, yeah.
But then you say scalable. How scalable? I mean, what's the upper limit here? Or is there not one?
So some of the heat shield work that we're doing, we've done in partnership with NASA, and they're looking at humans to Mars with this technology. So large systems. So when we look at scaling that in that size, this is like shipping container sized vehicles that can be transported around the world.
Okay. When you say humans to Mars, do you mean that the return will be to Mars or back to Earth?
So the heat shield originally was being developed by NASA to put humans on Mars. Right. It's just a low weight, high volume heat shield.
That makes sense. Yeah. And okay, so then when things are coming back, one assumes that they won't be damaged or in any way. Well, what's the sort of state of these things? Are they usable still? What happens to them? Never mind that in space, obviously, there's going to be various other bits of damage that's going to happen up there. But are we assuming that when they come back to Earth, they're pretty much good to go once you're refurbished?
Yeah, you can look at the NASA flew the Lofted mission last November. And if you look at post-flight of that, the system was, in perfect condition. The reason is that, once again, the surface area of that heat shield is so large that the satellite behind it is nicely tucked behind essentially inside of a cone of air that protects it. So we're protecting our vehicle inside of that, and that allows us to refurbish and refly it.
Definitely if you want to put humans in there at some point, right? It has to be pretty protective. What's the size of the market, do you think, then? You gave that stat at the beginning about how little has come back. Mm-hmm. If this becomes available in the way you hope it does, do you project how much might come back, or what the sort of unmet need is to bring things back?
I think that there's a lot of interesting markets. There's new markets, like I talked about. There's in just point-to-point logistics. There's obviously, like we've heard a lot today about in-space manufacturing and those markets. I'll tell you where I'm like personally interested, and what was one of the reasons I started this company is I think that we're not, space gives us the ability to protect our planet. It gives us the ability to monitor and understand change and make really important decisions about the impact we have on our planet. The problem is that we're not doing space sustainably. We're trying to be sustainable on Earth with an unsustainable space solution. We're building single-use satellites. We light them on fire. That's like the best way to deal with space trash is to burn it. It seems ridiculous. And that's only getting worse. Like the number of satellites going active in space every year is on an exponential. And if you take all of the mega constellations that are just public, not even the ones that we aren't hearing about, and you just add them all up and say, okay, well, they're all going to be about 5-year mission life, and I'm going to guess at what year I think everyone is active. When you get to that moment in time, it's very different than today. It's we count about 29,000 satellites that have to be replenished every single year to maintain those mega constellations. So in the world where 29,000 satellites have to be deorbited every year to put a new 29,000 up, deorbit becomes a very big problem. It's not what it is today, and I don't even think the regulations around 5-year till deorbit work anymore, because at that rate, that's equivalent to about 10 metric tons per day of satellites being atomized in our atmosphere. What are the environmental impacts of that? So how big is the market? Well, the satellite market's about 270 billion, and I would argue that there's a point in time where every satellite should be returnable and either reusable or recycled.
Okay. Well, Jason, that's been a fascinating chat, and thank you very much for that. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Appreciate it.